The sun hung high and merciless over the vast Wild West plain, spilling heat that shimmered across the parched earth like a fever dream. Dust curled up with each slow, deliberate step of a lone cowboy's horse, the animal's hooves drumming a weary rhythm against the cracked soil. He rode with his shoulders slightly bowed, not out of weakness, but from the weight of solitude, as though he carried years of silence on his back. His face bore the rugged geography of a man weathered by rejection and restless wandering, each line a canyon carved by regret. The world knew him as a drifter, a figure who did not quite belong to any town, yet was remembered in hushed tones, as though even his absence was enough to stir suspicion. The rails of an abandoned train station emerged from the haze, two rusted lines stretching into nowhere, swallowed by weeds and broken planks. The building leaned in on itself, windows shattered. The roof caved in like a chest too weary to hold breath. He slowed his horse and let silence settle, the kind of silence that feels older than a man's life. He did not expect company in such a forgotten place, and perhaps it was that expectation of loneliness that made what he saw next pierce through him like a knife through tender bark. There were 4 figures bound to posts along the edge of the platform, women gagged and trembling, their eyes wide with disbelief that someone had found them. The sight was too stark, too cruel against the broad daylight, as if the sun itself refused to cast mercy on their shame. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his spurs clinking against the boards, his boots crunching over glass and splinters. His hand hovered near the handle of his revolver, not from fear, but from instinct. There was no telling what hand of violence had left these women here to rot beneath the sun. He approached, his shadow stretching long before him, and the women stiffened, suspicion mixing with terror. One of them tried to turn her face away, as though she would rather endure thirst than meet the gaze of another man. His chest ached at that simple motion. He removed his hat, lowering his head with deliberate gentleness, as if he were stepping into a sacred space. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice cracked by dust yet steady as stone. "Ain't here to harm you." One by one, he cut their bindings, his knife glinting in the sun, and freed them from their wooden posts. Their wrists were raw rope burned, their throats dry from the gag's bite. They staggered like ghosts shaken loose from a cruel tether, each one marked by grief's fingerprint. When he offered a canteen of water, they hesitated, glancing among themselves, as though unsure if survival itself carried a price. Finally, the eldest reached forward with shaking fingers, took a sip, and passed it along. Gratitude lived only in their eyes, for their lips were still swollen, words trapped beneath mistrust. He noticed then the silver bands of widowhood they wore, rings dulled not by time, but by sorrow, the only treasure that had not been stripped from them. All 4 had buried husbands, and, with them, much of their hope. "Who left you here?" the cowboy asked in a low voice. But they shook their heads or looked to the ground, unwilling to summon ghosts with words. He did not press. He knew enough of shame to recognize it when it stood before him. By the time he guided them back toward the town's edge, the sun had begun its slow tilt westward, drawing long shadows that stretched like accusations. Whispers followed them even before they reached the saloon or general store. Women peered from curtains, men leaned on posts, children pointed with half curiosity, half cruelty. The sight of a drifter leading for widows was not a tale to be ignored in a town hungry for gossip. "Look at that," muttered one man loud enough to be heard. "Ain't been gone a week, and already he's rounded up a harem." Laughter followed, sharp as knives. The cowboy ignored it, though he felt the heat of shame rise under his collar. One of the widows turned to him, her voice cracking from thirst and bitterness. "Why risk your name for us? You'll be dirt in their eyes." He paused, adjusted his hat, and said simply, "Reckon my name ain't worth much anyhow." The words were quiet, but the weight behind them was heavy as stone, enough to silence even her protest. The widows found shelter in an old shack on the town's outskirts, half collapsed, but still capable of holding walls around them. The cowboy repaired the hinges, patched a broken door with whatever boards he could find, and chopped wood until his hands blistered. He fetched water from the well, carried it carefully as though each drop were worth more than his pride. Around him, The women kept their distance at first, watching with suspicion. Yet suspicion, when faced with consistent grace, begins to erode. Small moments of trust began to glimmer. When one widow dropped a pan, startled by a sudden gust of wind, he crouched without a word and helped gather the pieces, his touch respectful, his silence more comforting than words could be. At night, when they ate together, the sound of spoons against tin cups echoed through the dim room like a fragile hymn. Once, a nervous laugh escaped from one of the younger women, and though she covered her mouth quickly, it lingered like a candle flame in the dark. Days passed, and the cowboys' quiet rhythm wove itself into their lives. It was not heroics, but small acts of grace that built connection. A door mended, water carried, a blanket placed over weary shoulders without asking. Yet, amid the four, one widow drew his gaze more than the others. She was perhaps in her late 20s, her face still carrying the echoes of youth, though her eyes bore the depth of sorrow beyond her years. Her tongue was sharp when she spoke, often as a shield, yet her silence revealed more vulnerability than she wished. He caught her studying him sometimes, not with longing, but with the wary curiosity of someone testing if kindness was genuine or another disguise for hunger. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of amber and violet, she asked him, "Why do you help us?" "Ain't no fortune in it." He stared at the horizon, his voice low. "Guess I know what it feels like to be left behind." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, as though something unspoken had passed between them. He began to speak of his past in fragments, not willingly, but because her eyes seemed to pull truth from him. He told her of the woman he once loved, who chose another man, one with steadier land, a cleaner name. He had been left with nothing but the memory of her laughter and the ache of knowing he had not been enough. The widow, in turn, spoke of her husband, taken by senseless violence in a dispute over cattle, leaving her with nothing but scars of trust betrayed. Their silences became as meaningful as their words, glances exchanged like fragile promises, a connection not born of declaration, but of shared wounds. The town, however, was not blind. Whispers thickened like storm clouds. Men jeered as the cowboy passed. One spat in the dirt and called him a fool for guarding widows like hens. Another muttered loud enough, "Ain't right for women to take charity from a drifter. Shameful, that's what it is." The widows felt the weight of this cruelty, one breaking down in tears behind the shack, trembling under the burden of words. The cowboy knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Let 'em talk. Ain't words that keep a soul alive." She met his eyes and saw the truth of it, the quiet resilience of a man who had lived long under judgment and found ways to endure. But endurance has its limits, and the storm finally broke in the heart of town. One afternoon, as the widows fetched supplies with the cowboy at their side, a group of men blocked the path. Their leader sneered, his voice raised for all to hear. "For widows and one drifter, don't take much to see what's going on. Ain't decent, and we won't stand for it." The women froze, shame flooding their faces. The crowd gathered, whispers thickening. The cowboy stood tall, his hand resting at his belt not for violence, but for steadying himself. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the choice that weighed on him. For years he had been silent, enduring whispers, swallowing pride. But as he looked at the widow whose eyes had held him steady in the lonely nights, he knew silence would no longer serve. His voice rang out clear, rough but unwavering. "You call it shame. I call it honor. These women were left to die, and I'll stand by 'em till my bones give out. And as for her," he turned, meeting the gaze of the one who had begun to melt the ice around his heart. "I've carried this ring for years, thinkin' it belonged to a past gone forever. But I reckon it was waitin' for her." He pulled from his pocket a silver ring, tarnished but gleaming still, once his mother's, once a burden. He held it out to her, the crowd stunned into silence. His eyes softened, vulnerability laid bare in the open street. "I love you," he said simply, without flourish, without armor. "If you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling freely as she stepped forward, trembling yet radiant with a courage she had thought lost. Her hand lifted, and she let him slide the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'll have you." The crowd, robbed of its cruelty, stood in silence. Gossip had no teeth against dignity, and love confessed in the open light of day. The widows, once bound and abandoned, now stood unchained not only from rope, but from the weight of shame. The cowboy's heart, long burdened by rejection, lifted like a hawk on the wind. In that moment, he was no longer a drifter nor an outcast, but a man who had found belonging not in land or name, but in love freely chosen. The town's whispers faded into the dust, irrelevant as the rusted rails of the abandoned station. And so the tale closes, not with gunfire or thunder, but with the quiet triumph of dignity restored. Perhaps you, dear soul who listens to this old memory, know what it is to carry shame, to bow your head under the weight of cruel tongues. Let this be a reminder. Love blooms not in noise or haste, but in the stillness of small acts, in the endurance of kindness, and in the courage to speak truth when silence no longer serves. If your heart feels heavy with solitude, remember, sometimes love waits for you in the quiet, where you least expect it, steady as the sun, and as enduring as the dust beneath your feet.